We all have EDI strategies, but I can guarantee that the vast majority of those do not mention digital exclusion.
When we talk about digital exclusion, how would you describe that?
A selection of the population that has a continuing and unequal access and capacity to use the internet and digital technologies in ways that are essential to fully participate in society. The reality is, unless housing associations also see digital exclusion and tackling that as part of the issue, then all they're going to do is increase inequality.
Where do I actually start on this? What do I do?
I've developed a 12-point guide about how to really develop a meaningful digital exclusion program. So the first point.
Nick, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me, James.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. We're going to talk all things digital exclusion. But before we start, do you mind by just giving us an introduction to yourself, Nick?
Sure thing. So my day job is Chief Executive of Wythenshawe Community Housing Group, which is a 14,000 home registered provider based in South Manchester. I'm also chair of the Manchester Housing Providers Partnership, which covers all of the social housing providers in Manchester, and collectively our members own and manage the 70,000 social homes in Manchester. But perhaps crucially for this discussion as well, I'm also the lead for the Greater Manchester Housing Providers on all things data information governance and, crucially, digital exclusion.
Love that. Thank you. And as I said, we're going to talk all things digital exclusion today. But I suppose to just set the scene for the audience, when we talk about digital exclusion, what does that mean for you? Or how would you describe that?
It's basically a description that's used to capture a selection of the population that has a continuing and unequal access and capacity to use the internet and digital technologies in ways that are essential to fully participate in society. And that can manifest itself as inability to maximize their income through online savings and deals, can't access healthcare, GP appointments in the way that others can't access educational improvement opportunities and, crucially, job search opportunities as well. And I think when we talk about digital poverty, we kind of think that the barrier is about kit and having an internet connection. But actually, it's more nuanced than that. There are affordability is clearly one issue of an internet package. Access, having an internet connection. I mean, there are still parts of the UK that have poor or insufficient internet connection. Ability, a lot of people who might like to be online don't have the confidence or feel they have the skills to do it. And frankly, motivation's a factor as well. There's a body of evidence, and we'll come on and talk about that a lot of people just aren't motivated to get online. They've kind of managed so far in their life, and it's like, well, why should I bother to learn this new skill now?
Yeah, and well put. And actually, it's foreign to me as an individual, so I'm excited for this episode because we access most things we do day to day with a digital thing now, right? We do our shopping online. Everything becomes an online thing. So when people are excluded from digital, they are actually going to struggle as the future unfolds, aren't they? Because it's going to get harder and harder and harder to do things without being online.
Well, exactly that. It leads to a kind of segment of society, as you say, as more and more services are moved to assume that people can just access them digitally. People become more and more excluded. And so actually we entrench, some of those wicked problems that I've talked about, unemployment, poverty, poor educational achievement, poorer health, etc., by way of digital exclusion.
Very interesting. And obviously, I mean, we both work in the housing association world. There's a lot of pressures on housing associations now, right? Net zero, build new homes, a myriad of things that are going on and myriad of pressures. Why should digital exclusion be put on that list, and why should we add it to the list?
So it's a great question, and I've got 4 hopefully equally as robust responses to it. So the first one for housing associations is that our experience is that most progressive housing associations have transformation or change programs, whatever they may call them, that are designed to enable their customers to self-serve and, effectively divert demand from their call centres and into self-serve methodologies. And we're no different. But the reality is, unless housing associations also see digital exclusion and tackling that as part of the issue, then all they're going to do is increase inequality, because they'll create ways for some of their customers, hopefully a lot of them, to access services digitally. But also, if they don't address those at the lower end of the spectrum, they'll simply be left behind. And so that gap will increase. And of course, we all like to think we're not here to increase inequality. We're here to address inequality. So the second reason is that we all have EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion strategies, but I can guarantee that the vast majority of those do not mention digital exclusion.
Yeah.
And that is an inequality that needs addressing. And again, I would urge listeners to go back and review their EDI policies and say, why are we including digital exclusion in here? Third reason, most registered providers, we all have work programs out in the community and at the front line addressing, what I call these wicked problems: poverty of income, educational underachievement, providing employment support, poor health. And all of these efforts will be improved with better focus on reducing digital exclusion. And finally, the final reason is simply a statistical one. There's plenty of evidence to show that levels of digital exclusion are much higher amongst social housing tenants than the population at large. So we're already starting from a base of relative disadvantage.
Yeah, well put. I think, look, and I was going to ask that question actually, like, what are the stats between social housing tenants versus others? And you've already answered that. But I know you've done a load of work, Nick, in Greater Manchester, including a pilot to try and tackle digital exclusion. Talk us through that a little bit. Like, how did it come about, and kind of what have been some of the symptoms of that?
Yeah, sure. So across Greater Manchester, which just for context is 10 local authorities, we recognise, and by we, I mean myself as the GMHP lead on digital inclusion, but also working with Greater Manchester Combined Authority, particularly the Mayor, Andy Burnham, for whom digital exclusion was a big agenda of his. We looked at the problem and thought, how can we address it in a way that is scalable, can be done in partnership with the private sector, and by that we mean the big internet service providers. So I volunteered to kind of lead on that for GMHP and effectively use Wythenshawe Community Housing Group as the very first pilot organisation. And then we brought 4 other housing associations on board, and each of us worked with one of the big 5 internet service providers. So that's Virgin Media, BT, Vodafone, Hyperoptic, and TalkTalk. And together with the 10 local authorities, GMCA, ourselves, we really set ourselves the challenge of how can we create a sustainable digital inclusion model in social housing by working with the market. So what the commercial internet service providers did was really brilliant. They kind of set aside some of their more competitive instincts and focused on working with us and with each other on developing affordable social housing tariffs that kind of didn't necessarily make them any money, but helped address this issue, because this was a genuine piece of kind of R&D writ large, really. And so between us, between the 5 pairs of service providers and housing associations, we identified around 5,000 social housing tenants who we thought might benefit from this. So essentially we went out and said, look, there's these social housing tariffs. Are you interested in getting online? And also we offered free data SIMs as well that the internet service providers donated, which was great. And they were available to people, anyone really you're qualified for social housing could get a free data SIM. And what was really interesting is that the take-up was really low. What we found was that the factors I mentioned before, we were really tackling the access to devices and internet and the cost. What we weren't collectively tackling was the motivation, was a massive factor, and also the skills and confidence. And we'll come back to that bit because, we in Wythenshawe do a lot of work with people on that. But, collectively at scale, it was clear that there were a lot of people who just were like, no, mate, I'd love to do it, but I can't afford it. Or I don't want to get involved with this because it's just too complicated. So we ran this exercise. It was, a multi-month exercise. And actually Liverpool University produced a great report on studying the outcomes of it, which can be found by kind of Googling Greater Manchester Combined Authority Digital Inclusion Pilot. So that was what we did. As I say, the outcome was kind of interesting. Why aren't these issues solvable by us? And the answer really was, and maybe that you'll come on to this in terms of the outcomes of the pilot. In fact, I'll stop talking and let you ask the question.
Well, you've asked it, but what was the takeaways? What were the outcomes of the pilot? I'm interested to see kind of.
Yeah.
Can't believe people didn't take it up, to be honest. But then, when you mention motivation, I kind of think, yeah, it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense.
Well, and also we ran this pilot during the cost of living crisis, and basically people's spending priorities were very focused on heating and eating, that analysis has been well trailed. So I think what we took away was firstly a deeper understanding that people are rarely digitally excluded for a single reason. And, you can offer people the support, but actually getting people to accept it is quite tricky. We also underestimated how many people that we thought were digitally excluded actually in their view weren't, because if they needed to do something, they had family and friends who helped them do it. So even though they might not have access, they had access to people who did have access. And again, that's a very grey area that it was very difficult to kind of measure that. The other big takeaway is that such is the depth and scale of digital exclusion. Across Greater Manchester, we estimated there were 1.2 million digitally excluded people. Such is the depth and scale that you can't expect not-for-profit local authorities and the private sector to come together and generate a solution that's going to crack it. It does require a centralized government support to work with the charities, the not-for-profits, the service providers, etc. And that requires a kind of big culture shift, really, that we need government to see digital exclusion as the same as someone who can't access clean water or hasn't got access to electricity or gas. None of those things would be considered acceptable, and yet we're happy to carry on not addressing the digital exclusion issue. And to be fair, the current government is much more tuned into this and much more positive about doing something about it. The other takeaway was that not everyone wants to access digital inclusion and online access through their home. People generally use a lot of smartphones, and a lot of services simply aren't geared towards smartphone use.
Yep.
And that's actually a big takeaway for housing associations, that when they're designing access to services, please don't assume that's on a laptop. It needs to be accessible through people's smartphone first mindsets. But clearly some government services, you can generally try and book a health appointment via your smartphone. But if you've ever tried to fill in a universal credit application on a smartphone, you will not get very far, So there are different barriers depending on the kind of issue. Or if you're an 18-year-old trying to, pursue your education and doing that on a smartphone, that's not going to work for you either. So they were the sort of big takeaway, which made us think, okay, we've learned a lot from this. What do we do about it, really?
Nice. And yeah, I've got quite a few follow-ons from that, but I suppose that the first point would be, if I'm sat in a, I don't know, chief executive, whatever role in a housing association right now, and I'm thinking, right, where do I start? Like, where do I actually start on this? What do I do? Because do I ring Nick and just say, Nick, help me?
Well, you could ring Nick, but
Yeah.
Actually, because of that exact question and the kind of grey nature of the results that came out that didn't give a definitive solution, I've developed a 12-point guide for housing providers and indeed other organisations as well about how to really develop a meaningful digital exclusion program. And if we've got time, I'll run through quickly give a snippet of the headline.
That'd be perfect, yeah.
So the first point is having good data about your residents, because when we started the exercise, we found that we didn't know who was digitally excluded or not. And we ended up using proxy measures like, well, who's got an email address? But, clearly that didn't mean very much, because loads of people have email addresses and never use them. So having really good data about your residents is crucial. That's crucial if you have a transformation program. It's crucial if you wish to stay on the right side of the regulators' consumer standards as well. So that's not a nice to have. That's a kind of core part of it.
Yeah.
The second thing is to come up with your own understanding of what a minimum digital living standard is for your tenants. And there's some really great guidance out there. For example, a charity called the Good Things Foundation have a document called A Living Standard for a Digital Age. And you can use elements of that to kind of say, right, this is what we think is the minimum standard we want. And it could be just as crude as we want them to be able to use our new fancy app when we launch it, so that they can access services and reduce demand on our call centres. The third thing, as I mentioned earlier, is that tackling digital exclusion has to be built into transformation programs. So if you are that chief exec, go and talk to your transformation lead and say, how are we integrating, looking at the issue of digital exclusion into our transformation program, making it a strategic issue, not simply a kind of community, a nice to have issue. Fourthly, tackling digital exclusion does require someone who is the project sponsor for that program sponsor, and they have to be sat around the exec team table, or certainly, if not that, the next tier down, because all corporate strategies should be looked at and appraised, going back to my EDI point, through the lens of, does this strategy take us closer towards digital inclusion of our customers, or does it increase that divide? Fifthly, there is a lot of internal team collaboration that's required between, for example, financial inclusion teams, tenancy support teams, back office data insight, data governance teams, PR and comms, so that residents know what's out there, and community and resident engagement, and crucially, asset management, who are responsible for negotiating the way leaves with the internet service providers, etc. Sixth, I mentioned the wicked problems, but again, if you're doing all the community work with your residents on worklessness, poor health, poverty, etc., then you have to have a kind of overlay of, yes, but are we addressing digital exclusion, or are we just tackling the visible bit of the problem? 7, collaborative partnerships. You are not alone in this. There will be other registered providers in your area who may already be working on it. So reach out, find out who's doing what. If you've got regional groupings of housing associations, have a look at that. Talk to local authorities. Local authorities, certainly in GM, have been brilliant at really getting on board and ramping up their work on all of this. And so there are plenty of really productive, highly motivated people out there at local authority, combined authority, housing association, and indeed charity level as well. Number 8, try stuff. Try hyper local stuff. Do you have small scale programs that can provide training and kit, etc., to residents? And what do you learn from that? Use residents to spread the word about why they found it beneficial to get online. Coming back to this point, what you're trying to do is change hearts and minds from a caucus of residents who don't particularly want to do this. And we can't force people to do it, and we shouldn't do. What we have to do is create the conditions in which people motivate themselves and say, I want a slice of this action, and I want to go and talk to my housing provider about how they can help me do this.
Yeah.
Number 9, and this won't be popular, but the reality is we can't tackle this without resource and investment. So, the finance directors do need to recognise that there has to be a budget for this work, and you have to have the exec level sponsor for sure, but you also need someone, at a more frontline project management level who's actually been given the time and authority to do this work, to do the reaching out, to do the collaboration, to do the developing partnerships and et cetera, et cetera. And that requires, a budget for it. And I know that's difficult, but the costs of not doing it are even greater, actually, in the long run. You need access to community assets as well. If you've got community centres, what is being provided from those? Because what we found through the pilot is that people like going to see trusted people in trusted spaces where they feel comfortable, even though they may not be doing something that they're entirely comfortable with, but at least their surroundings are comfortable. It's a misnomer, I think, to expect that rolling out fancy apps and shifting people / nudging people to online is going to save you money. I don't believe it does, not because I'm a cynic, but because I don't expect it to. I expect it to be a long-term burn, really. And similarly, leaving behind a caucus of people who can't get online, isn't very helpful. Point 10, don't forget printed communications. I know it's kind of super hip now to think, everything should be, TikToked and done through, should be done through dance and the mime. But actually, for many people who aren't digitally included, paper clearly explaining in concise, compassionate, supportive ways what they can do is what really matters to them. Point 11, do recognise that it's hard work. You are going to get a lot of residents who just aren't interested. And as I say, thinking about how do you create that hearts and minds engagement culture. And then finally, there are social tariffs out there that the internet service providers have made available. And, whilst they might not be affordable to everyone, it is really worth getting in touch with your local internet service providers and pushing them out there, because there will be some take up, albeit it won't necessarily be at scale and pace that you might be after. So in brief, that's a kind of 12-point guide as to how to do this tricky stuff, really.
Yeah, and it's really useful. And I presume, if people reach out, you've got this written. So have you got this in some sort of a document or something that you could share? Or
I have a very nice presentation.
Oh, lovely.
I take around the country to anyone who'll listen to it, basically.
I'm sure many people will be reaching out for that presentation, but it's really useful to have that. And I suppose the important thing there is you've captured the physical with the emotional. So you've done the hearts and minds piece along with the actual stuff that needs to happen in this process. And that's the most important thing. And if I am a housing association that's never thought about it, I'm sure there's none, but if I've never done anything about it in action terms, it's hard to start these things, right? It's hard to even understand what the data's telling you, let alone anything else. So, no, really, really useful, Nick. And I suppose, where are Wythenshawe up to in the process of tackling digital exclusion at the moment?
As you can imagine, as the digital inclusion lead, I want our organisation, if not best practice, and certainly to be up there with one of the best organisations. So I previously talked about the 12 lessons that we had from the digital inclusion project that we did with the GMCA. And basically, we're trying to do as many of those things as possible. But in particular, the early wins that we've had is viewing digital inclusion as a kind of part of our transformation strategy, so that, we don't actually have a transformation stream that just increases the problem. Secondly, we are having a big push on customer data and really trying to ensure that we capture in ways that are appropriate to the customers, who is online and who isn't. Because not only does that help us fine-tune our ways of contacting them and ensure they get the best service, but it enables us to size the task that we have, really. We've actually added more resource, which has been great. We now have a full-time digital inclusion officer, which is really good, to supplement the resources that we already had with a part-time manager. We are making sure but steady progress. But I think the point I'd emphasize is that this is a long game. This is not something that you can just have a quick burst of activity and solve. It requires a kind of embedded organizational approach.
Yeah. And is there any plans in the future for the MHPP to tackle it collectively, do you see? Or how do you see that playing out in the future? Yes,
really. I mean, in the sense that Manchester already have a brilliant digital inclusion team, and I'm fortunate that I sit on their digital inclusion strategy group, so get called in to kind of support their work and drive their agendas forward. And then as chair of MHPP, we can promote the work there. And also we take it into the Greater Manchester housing provider space as well. We've been really encouraged by the level of interest that other organisations have in this. People are recognising that it is a genuine issue for their communities and that they are appropriate organisations to engage with it. And more generally, I'm a bit of an evangelist. I go on conferences all over the place speaking about this. I mean, next week I'm flying to Northern Ireland to speak at the Northern Ireland Housing Conference to speak about it. And then I've got various other conferences around the UK to just keep getting the messages over that we've run through in this podcast.
Nick, honestly, I've obviously known you for quite a long time, and we do some work with your business, and it's so refreshing that someone's re-put this on the agenda, because honestly, until this podcast, I thought that the problem had gone away, in truth, and it clearly hasn't. But it's really refreshing for someone to be tackling something, but not just for your organisation, but from what it sounds like, the collaboration is going to be so important if we are going to fix digital exclusion and inclusion for the future. But thank you for coming to talk to us on The Hip, and appreciate your insights into the topic.
Not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, James. So great to see you again, and look forward to our continuing relationship with you.
Cheers, Nick. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Hip. If you'd like to hear more from us, please be sure to follow us on your favourite podcast platform. We are also running a 30-minute clinic free of charge to any clients that want to recruit in a more inclusive way. For more information, please reach out to us on our website, andersonjames.com.